Welcome back to Energy Shots. It's again been a busy 2 weeks in energy. We've got sanctions setting in on Russian energy exports today. There's an ongoing a newly renewed peace negotiation happening around Ukraine, and the U.S. is looking at policy options to even put further pressure on Russia. Kevin, we're back.
Good morning.
Kevin, so much has happened in the last 3 days, 48 hours, even the last 6. What are you watching today and over the weekend?
Well, you brought up Russia and also Venezuela. And I think that, frankly, over the last day, there was also Iran news, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors meeting. We call it the IRV, the IRNV, on sanctions. Definitely very interesting. And I've been thinking a lot lately, Joseph, about what energy security can do for you.
And energy security can do for me, for the United States, or for the world?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. So let's talk about what energy security is in a sort of a new way. I'd like to give 2 dimensions with this chart here. This may be a little bit of a complicated chart, and if you haven't seen one like this before, this is not a common way to depict data, but that's what we are here to do on Energy Shots, is give you a new way to think about things. On the x-axis, down below, what you have is the net import share of supply here in the United States from 2000 through 2024. So the 25-year interval. Those are data from the International Energy Agency.
So this is the flows of oil, gas, and other sources of primary energy in and out of the United States.
So on a net import share of that total.
So does it have hydro?
This is everything. All the energy going into the U.S., how much of that was net imports.
Got it.
And here in 2000, it's 27%, comes all the way out to 32%, 2005, 2006, and then goes to negative 10%. We're now exporting on a net basis. So that is one obvious measure of energy security. You have a sort of a net exporter status as opposed to net imports. But the second dimension is one that we typically talk about as a measure of efficiency. This is the energy intensity of real GDP using 2015 dollars. And it's not typically talked about as an energy security metric, but I would posit that it could be. You can think about energy intensity of GDP as a security metric on the demand side. How much energy do you need to generate output for your economy? When that goes down, it is a measure of energy security. Now, it may come from deindustrialization, which isn't necessarily the right way to achieve all kinds of security, but it means that you are less vulnerable from an energy risk perspective to the maintenance or growth of your economy. And that has gone from about 6,500 BTU per 2015 real dollar down to about 3,800 BTU per dollar. So that's a 40% reduction.
Let me try and jump in and try to interpret on the audience side here just for a moment, Kevin. So you've got the energy intensity of GDP, how much energy you need to get a unit of economic production, right? To drive your car, to heat your home, to run your business. And what we've seen over the last 25 years is a drop in that of almost a half.
Yes.
And so if you then have price volatility in international oil markets, the idea here is that you actually are kind of secured against that kind of volatility because you need less energy per unit of GDP. Is that roughly correct?
That's more than roughly correct. It's dead on. And it also gets to the point about supply disruptions. If you are short energy and you're less dependent on energy for your economic growth, the economic consequences of shortage are less.
So there's 2 things here going on. Not only are you're decreasing the share of imports and actually becoming a net exporter, but over the same time, your argument is the U.S., by reducing or increasing its energy efficiency, is securing itself not against like all sorts of perturbations in the energy market.
Yes, and hence the 2 dimensions. So we have essentially a supply side dimension on the net import basis, and then we have a demand side dimension on the GDP intensity. So
excellent. So what does this enable?
Well, that's just it. You can do a lot of things with this. Maybe we'll go to the next slide and talk about that. One of the things that I think we all well understand is that we've produced a lot of liquids, oil, natural gas liquids, biofuels here in the United States over the last 15 years.
Right.
And so through the 15 years through 2024, you're looking at EIA data showing that global liquid supply, which is this green line, which ducked down a little in the Great Recession and then rose and then ducked down again in COVID, and then rose about 16 million barrels per day over that 15-year interval. The blue line is the U.S. liquids supply, which did about 14 million barrels per day over that interval, which comes into about 80%. Roughly 80% of the net addition that we've seen in supply came from the U.S. Now that's I think, a measure of energy security not just for the U.S., but also for the world. It's provided a stabilizing buffer on price, and we talk about that a lot. You've talked about that a lot.
Yep.
It's a common theme. Maybe we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what that looks like from a sort of an OPEC plus spare capacity perspective and what it means to have market share.
Yeah.
Coming up on the U.S. side, which is the blue line here, about 12 percentage points of global liquids market share increase from the U.S. alone, which corresponds, and it's not just coincidental, there's a causal link here, corresponds to a reduction in market share of about 7 percentage points by the OPEC plus producers, which means that they retreated from the market for a variety of reasons, not just U.S. production, but also demand retracements, the reversals of those great perturbations that we talked about. But what that means is that there's not only more supply buffering from the U.S., but now more spare capacity on the side. And if you are looking at what that means geostrategically in terms of your option set, what does energy do for you, you ask? Well, we are now in a position where the United States is levying economic force projection against major energy producing countries, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. Today, as you mentioned, being the day the General License 126 phases out the wind down period for Lukoil and Rosneft. And sanctions essentially go mostly into effect.
So I want to talk about that for a second, but let's pause here just to reflect for a moment. The rise of the U.S. in market share, here we're looking in global liquids, and the decline of OPEC plus, how does that play out in the U.S.-Saudi relationship? Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was in Washington this week. A lot of positive announcements about economic investment going both ways, AI, infrastructure. Energy played almost a sideline role. What was your interpretation of that?
Well, we suspect that it probably got mentioned at some point behind closed doors, particularly given that economic force projection. Where would the barrels come from if barrels disappear from market in Venezuela?
Right.
There is a ready supplier with spare capacity in the wings. It was not the headline, though. You're very correct to note.
Well, and then the energy investments that we saw are actually Saudi investments in U.S. export facilities for LNG, sort of increasing the U.S. presence in global markets rather than trying to quash it. Does that portend a future of more cooperation?
It looks like it. Memoranda of understanding and investment intent are one thing. Actual follow through is another. But I think we're seeing a tightening in the coupling. The U.S. gas supply has become a really important part of diversification for a lot of partners.
But then what we have now is a U.S. that has increased its own energy security and is using it to project power economically around the world. We've got some updates on that front as well.
Yeah, well, so this is where it turns out that sanctions are difficult to enact, hard to maintain, and they don't always permanently diminish supplies. So in May of 2018, President Trump in his first term withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And over the course of the next year phased out the sanctions relief that treaty, that compact, not a treaty, that agreement had provided. And so the trailing 12-month Iranian crude and condensate levels plummeted initially and then began to rise, and they've continued rising. They're essentially, as of the trailing 12 months through October, back to where they were at the time of the phase out of sanctions relief in May of 2019. So the levels have returned. Now, at the same time, the share that has been going to China has increased rather significantly. And so the question about sanctions, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, isn't just the question of reinforcement with new measures, but also enforcement. How far are you going to go? And I think there are sometimes very big challenges in trying to enforce sanctions against parties that either are insulated from them or present major economic stress on global economies if you were to go through and actually cut them off from the U.S. banking system.
Where there is a will, there's a way. Markets reorganize around demand.
And this takes us up, I guess, to yesterday. So as that crude and condensate flow has gone to the world, we all know that the Iranian enrichment program started to really ramp up after that withdrawal. And now there's a fairly significant stockpile. What this green dot shows is if you took the entire stockpile through June, where the International Atomic Energy Agency last was able to review and inventory it, took all of the different concentrations at different levels of enrichment, and later enriched it and converted it to 90% weapon grade equivalent. This is the level of inventory that implies. Spreadsheet exercise. If they don't have centrifuges operable, that's not necessarily possible. But there's still a stockpile and a lot of questions about where it's going to go. The Board of Governors at the International Atomic Energy Agency yesterday asked Iran to allow inspectors to look at the facilities that had been damaged and also to try to identify and locate that stockpile, which suggests to some degree that maybe the economic pressure, the sanctions risk against Iran is not diminishing.
Right. And so in this, it's like, what does this tell us? This tells us it's hard to enforce sanctions, and the outcome that the United States was trying to achieve, which is the reducing the ability of Iran to enrich uranium, has failed?
Well, the sanctions were one tool, but there were other tools that were brought to bear. And I guess the question is, on sanctions alone, what can you do?
Right.
Military strategists often talk about how wars can't be won solely by airstrikes. I think that when you look at statecraft and military engagement, there's a lot of tools brought to bear.
And this again raises the question of, what do we do about Russia and the Ukraine war? Right? Where one of the key tools that the United States has tried to leverage has been sanctions on Russian energy exports to reduce revenues, create pressure on the Russian economy. It's been very hard to do. Now we've got active legislation in the United States, which would give the president more power to put pressure on Russian exports by tariffing and sanctioning the buyers as well as Russian oil companies. But the same challenges, I think we're going to face the same challenges in markets finding a way around these implements. And we need to demonstrate probably a long-term commitment to a project of reducing oil revenues over the long term to have a credible threat to push Russia to the table.
What did you think of the 28-point peace plan?
I think 28-point peace plan released just yesterday has remarkable elements. I think it's got some surprising ambitions toward U.S. and Russian economic cooperation. I think it asks a lot of Ukraine and a lot of NATO, places a lot of immediate conditions on their military presence, on the role that Ukraine can play in the broader West, and sort of backloads, in my opinion, a lot of Russian obligations. There's some asymmetry there that I think is probably going to have to be addressed before we can get buy-in from Ukraine, before the president can get buy-in from Ukraine or Europe.
It's interesting, when it came out, when it was first announced, before any of us got to see it, the crude market sold off. And I think traders at some level were imagining two things were possible.
Right.
Our view was that at one level they thought that if there were to be peace, then sanctions relief would probably be a part of that peace.
Yep.
And that would bring barrels back to market, more supply, lower price, that's pretty straightforward. But the second part, I think, may have been also implicit. Over the last several months when negotiations were active, the Trump administration said, well, we don't want to put new sanctions on. So that bill you're talking about, the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 from Senator Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, who you had here for an event this week, terrific event.
Yep. Check out the link below.
That bill could pass, but maybe the administration might not want to put the sanctions on because they don't want to stop the negotiation. In the past, the administration argued that if we do this, if we put more pressure, Putin will walk away from the table. And so I think that initial sell-off showed some skepticism, and maybe we'll see what happens over coming days. But before we get too mired in that topic, because I think we could spend all day on
what does energy security allow us to do?
What else can energy security do?
Well, Kevin, we've talked a few times over the course of Energy Shots about the energy demand growth associated with AI. Sometimes when you think about these big AI data centers and you talk to people in the digital industry, they talk about them as factories, right? They're manufacturing intelligence in the form of digital tokens, and so they want to talk about them in the way that we sometimes talk about traditional manufacturing. So I've been looking at manufacturing and energy use historically to try to understand where have trends been and where might they go, especially in the context of all these economic security imperatives that the United States feels now around reshoring. So what are we looking at? This is a related metric to what you were showing us earlier. It's not exactly the same. On the blue line, or on the left-hand side here, we've got manufacturing output, also in 2015 dollars, from all the manufacturing sectors in the United States, BEA data. And then you've got from the EIA, which runs surveys of manufacturers around the country, how much energy to use, in what form, and how. The amount of energy used, first use energy use, so it can be recycled and other things within facilities, sporadically throughout the time. Unfortunately, we don't do that survey every year, and it takes a long time to put it together. So the most recently available estimates we have are for 2022. There's going to be a new release of that report early next year, scheduled for early next year, so we'll get some more updated numbers for the post-COVID period. But there's two things here I think are important to see. One, despite changing impressions of the health of the U.S. manufacturing sector, even in inflation-adjusted terms, U.S. manufacturing output has gone up over the last 25 years. And two, the amount of energy used by U.S. manufacturing has remained static or even gone down, which tells us something kind of interesting, and it echoes what you were talking about earlier in the sort of increasing energy efficiency of the economy, while that's also playing out in the manufacturing world. So if you take the quotient of those two numbers, and you look at, you can see a falling energy intensity within the United States manufacturing sector.
So this is just a subset of the overall economy.
Exactly.
We're looking at energy intensity of GDP.
Yep.
Same basic numerator, except a subset of the whole economy.
Exactly.
And the same denominator.
Yes, and it fell, again, almost in half over that same whole period.
Okay.
As manufacturing output got more efficient and more valuable for the United States. Both of those matter when you make this calculation.
Sure, numerators and denominators.
Of course. And so, one of the things I then want to try to understand is, what are the energy implications of trying to reshore manufacturing? This is a big political goal of both the Biden administration, was a political of the Biden administration, now is one of the Trump administration. And so what we're looking at here is a counterfactual. This is the real world energy use for manufacturing in 2022. So you're just over 20,000 billion BTU. And over here, I said, well, what if you had the same manufacturing share of global manufacturing that we had in the 1990s, but you had that in 2022? What would have been the energy implications if you had the same sort of efficiency gains over that time? And what you can see is you would need about 60% more energy in a sort of static U.S. for the U.S. to have a static role in global manufacturing,
right,
compared to the overall growth than we had.
So this green bar is if we were to return to our old status as what you've called a manufacturing superpower.
Yep.
This is the additional energy that we would need
Yes.
in quadrillion, or I guess in 10,000 billion BTU.
Exactly.
Quads.
So in 1990, in the 1990s, we were roughly a quarter of global manufacturing in output terms.
Okay.
That's fallen to roughly 15%. So the calculation is highly linear, but what it tells you is if you wanted to go back up to a quarter, if that was an economic project that the United States wanted to embark upon, which sounds reasonable from everything I hear from our political leadership, this would be the energy implication of doing that.
If only we had a secure, plentiful, affordable, endogenous resource base.
It turns out we actually do have that, Kevin, as you saw earlier. And so the big question then is, what kind of manufacturing, what do we want to make? How do we want to access global markets? Is it for our own consumption? Is it for export that would allow us to get back to these kinds of figures? Because I think we can be fairly confident that we could power that manufacturing.
Well, that seems like a topic we'll want to dig into a little bit more, maybe talking about the composition of the things we make, where they're going to go, and which energy resources we will rely on to energize that process.
I look forward to doing that with you, Kevin. There's some really interesting stuff in there on chemical manufacturing and a variety of other places where the U.S. has real technical and economic leads.
I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Colleagues, thank you for joining us. Hope you have an energetic day. Kevin, we're signing off.
All right.